In a quiet village there was an old convent surrounded by tall trees and peaceful silence. It was the kind of place where time moved slowly. Inside this convent lived many nuns, each with her own duties. Some taught children, some cared for the sick, and some spent hours in prayer. Among them was one elderly nun who didn't talk much. She moved slowly, her hands often busy with simple tasks like folding laundry or watering the garden. No one paid much attention to her. She was just the old sister who always smiled gently and kept to herself. She had been living in the convent for many years, so long that even the younger nuns didn't know much about her past. They only knew that she was kind, quiet, and always ready to help. Her room was small and plain, and she never asked for anything. She didn't complain, didn't speak about herself, and never caused any trouble. People respected her, but they didn't really see her. One morning, a beautiful wooden piano arrived at the convent. It was a gift from a local donor who thought the sisters could use some music during prayer times. The younger nuns were excited. They cleaned the chapel, opened the windows to let in the fresh air, and placed the piano near the front, where sunlight fell softly on the floor. Everyone gathered around the instrument, touching the keys and laughing as they tried to play simple tunes. The elderly nun stood at the back, quietly watching. Her eyes stayed fixed on the piano longer than anyone noticed. When the others were busy talking, she slowly walked toward it. Her fingers trembled a little as she reached out to touch the keys. She pressed one gently. The sound was soft, almost like a whisper. But before she could press another, a younger nun turned to her and smiled kindly. "Maybe don't strain yourself, sister," she said, putting a hand on her arm. "Your hands are not so strong anymore." The old nun didn't say a word, just nodded and stepped back. Nobody meant to be rude. They thought they were helping. After all, she was old, her back was slightly bent, and her fingers looked fragile. They didn't know what she had once been. No one asked. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, the old nun sat by her window. The moonlight fell across her. Flora, she looked at her hands. They were wrinkled and thin now, but once they had danced across piano keys in grand halls. Once, she had worn elegant dresses and stood under bright stage lights, performing in front of thousands. But that life was long gone. Buried under years of silence and service, she had given it all up after something painful happened in her past, something she never spoke about. She found peace in the quiet walls of the convent, and slowly, the world outside forgot her name. She didn't mind, not until she saw that piano again. The sound of the keys, even that single note she played, had awakened something deep inside her, a memory. A feeling she had locked away long ago. No one in the convent knew. They were living with someone who once brought people to tears with her music. No one knew what she had left behind. To them, she was just an old nun who walked slowly and spoke softly. But something had started to change. A spark had been lit, and soon the world would hear that sound again. They just didn't know it yet. The piano became a regular part of life at the convent. During prayer time, soft music would fill the small chapel. One of the younger sisters had started learning simple hymns, and others would often gather around to listen. It brought a warm feeling to everyone's heart. The music was not perfect, but it brought joy. The sisters would smile, hum along, and sometimes even clap when a tune ended. It became a new kind of happiness in the quiet routine of the convent. But there was one person who stayed away. The old nun never came near the piano again. She would walk by it slowly, her eyes lingering for a moment, and then she would carry on with her duties. Some noticed, but no one said anything. They thought she simply wasn't interested. Or maybe she just liked to listen from a distance. What they didn't know was that every note played pulled on her heart like a memory calling her name. Fingers would twitch sometimes when she heard a song she once knew by heart. There was one younger sister who began to notice the way the old nun looked at the piano. She had a gentle heart and paid close attention to small things. One evening after dinner, she saw the elder sitting alone in the garden, staring at the trees, her face calm but her eyes deep in thought. She quietly walked over and sat beside her. "You really like the piano, don't you?" she asked softly. The old nun looked at her, surprised for a moment. Then she smiled but didn't answer. The younger sister waited a little longer, then asked again, "Did you ever play before?" There was silence for a few seconds. Then finally, the older nun nodded. She didn't speak right away. But after a deep breath, she said something the young sister never expected to hear. "I used to be a pianist, a long time ago." The young nun's eyes widened. "Really? Like just for fun?" The old woman gave a tiny smile and shook her head. "No, I played on stages, big ones, before I came here." That small moment changed everything. The younger nun was shocked. She had never imagined this quiet, gentle woman once lived a life of music and applause. That night, she couldn't stop thinking about it. She told a few of the other sisters, and they were all just as surprised. The next few days, whispers moved through the convent. Was it really true? Could the old nun have once been a professional musician? No one had seen her touch the piano, so it was hard to believe. Some thought maybe it was just a part of her past she barely remembered. But the younger nun, who had heard the truth, believed her completely. She decided to ask again. One afternoon, while most were busy in the garden, she gently took the old nun's hand and led her into the chapel. "No one's here," she said softly. "Just you and the piano." The old nun looked at the keys. She hesitated. Her hands were no longer strong. Her back ached. But something in her heart told her to try. She sat down slowly and placed her fingers gently on the keys. At first, nothing happened. Then, very softly, she began to play. And in that quiet room, something magical started. The sound was not loud. It was gentle and full of emotion. The notes came out slowly, but with so much feeling that even the silence seemed to listen. She didn't know it yet. But this was only the beginning. The world outside had no idea what was coming. But soon, they would all know the truth. Hidden talent never really disappears. Sometimes, it just waits for the right moment to be heard again. The sound of music echoed softly through the empty chapel. The old nun's fingers moved slowly at first, as if remembering where to go. But as the seconds passed, the notes became clearer, smoother, deeper. She closed her eyes. Her back was slightly bent, her hands aged, but the music that came from her was something else. It wasn't just sound, it was a feeling. Every note carried a story. Every pause was filled with something words couldn't explain. The young nun who had brought her to the piano stood quietly nearby. She didn't want to speak or interrupt. Her eyes were wide, her heart beating a little faster. She had never heard anything like this before. Not from a recording, not from the other sisters, and not from any concert she had ever seen online. This was something different. It was raw, it's honest, alive. She wasn't the only one who noticed, unknowingly. A few other sisters had entered the chapel during the playing. They had heard the music from the hallway and followed the sound. One by one, they stepped inside and stood silently in the back, watching and listening. No one dared to speak. They were completely still, as if the moment would disappear if they made a sound. The old nun didn't see them. Her eyes stayed closed. She was lost in the music, lost in a world she hadn't visited in many years. Her hands, though old, remembered everything. The notes came from memory, not from any sheet. It was as if the piano had waited all this time just for her. When she finished playing, there was a moment of silence. A few sisters had tears in their eyes. Then, slowly, a quiet clap came from the back. The old nun opened her eyes in surprise. She turned around and saw the small group standing there, smiling, some with their hands over their hearts. She looked down, almost shy, and whispered, "I didn't know anyone was here." One of the sisters stepped forward and said, "That was the most beautiful thing we've ever heard." After that evening, something changed in the convent. The story of the old nun's music spread among the sisters. They didn't look at her the same way anymore. There was a quiet respect in their eyes now, mixed with curiosity. People wanted to know more about her past, but she didn't say much. She only smiled gently and said, "That was another lifetime." But they knew there was more. The piano, which had once been just a simple addition to the chapel, now held special meaning. Every time the old nun played, more sisters would come and sit, even if it was just for a short moment. Her music didn't need words. It reached the heart in a way no one could explain. The younger nun, who had first brought her to the piano, became her quiet supporter. She helped set up the bench, turned pages when needed, and often just sat close by while the old nun played. She never pushed, never asked too many questions. She just listened, and sometimes that was enough. Soon, people outside the convent began to hear whispers of the music. A visitor, who had come to drop off some supplies, heard the old nun play through the open chapel door. He stood frozen, holding a box in his hands, not wanting to miss a single note. He asked the younger sister who was playing, and she only smiled and said, "Someone very special." What started as a simple moment of music had slowly become something greater. It was healing. It was inspiring. And even though the old nun never asked for attention or applause, her gift was beginning to speak louder than she ever expected. What no one knew yet was that the real surprise hadn't even happened. The world outside had no idea who was hidden behind the chapel walls, but soon they would find out. The days passed quietly, but the chapel was no longer the same. It had become a place where something special lived. Whenever the old nun sat down at the piano, it felt like the whole building breathed with her. She didn't play every day, and she never asked for an audience. But somehow, people always seemed to know when she would appear. One by one, the other sisters would quietly gather inside, taking their places on the old wooden benches. Listening in silence, no one spoke while she played. No one needed to. The music spoke for her, carried something beyond just melody. It carried years of joy, pain, memories, and love. Her fingers, though wrinkled and slow, still knew the language of music perfectly. And every time she touched the keys, it felt like time itself slowed down. One afternoon, a group of children came to visit the convent. They were from a nearby school and had come with their teacher to learn about the life of the sisters. The children were full of energy, asking questions and running around the garden. One of the sisters invited them into the chapel for a moment of quiet. The old nun was already sitting at the piano when they entered. She looked over her shoulder and gave a warm smile, then turned back to the keys. The teacher whispered to the children to sit down and listen. The old nun began to play something soft, something gentle, like a lullaby. The children, who had been restless a moment before, sat still. Their eyes were wide. They didn't move, didn't whisper. They were completely caught in the moment. After the music stopped, one little boy raised his hand and asked, "Can she teach me how to play like that?" Everyone smiled, including the old nun. She looked at the boy and said quietly, "It starts with listening." What happened next was unexpected. The teacher recorded a short video of the performance on her phone, not to share it publicly, just to remember it. But later that evening, she showed it to her husband, who was a music lover. He was shocked by the depth and beauty of the performance. He couldn't believe it was an elderly nun in a village chapel. Without thinking much, he uploaded the short clip to a music page online with a caption, "Found this hidden gem today, no one knows her name. But listen to this. By morning." The video had started to spread. People were sharing it, commenting, and asking, "Who is she?" Musicians, artists, and even famous pianists were amazed. Some said the feeling in her music was more powerful than anything they had heard in years. Others asked if she had any albums, any past concerts, but there was no information. No name. No story, just the image of an old woman in a plain habit, sitting at a wooden piano, playing as if the music lived inside her soul. Back at the convent, the sisters had no idea the video had gone viral. They carried on as usual, prayers, chores, cooking, and care. It wasn't until someone from the village ran up to the chapel with their phone and showed the ungirt younger sister the post that they realized what had happened. The younger sister's eyes went wide as she watched the clip and read the comments. Her heart pounded. She gently approached the old nun, who was in the garden watering the plants. "People around the world are listening to your music," she said softly. "They don't even know your name, but they feel something when you play." The old nun paused for a moment. She looked up at the sky and smiled, then turned back to her plants. "I didn't think they'd remember," she whispered. But maybe they needed to. And just like that, the quiet story of a forgotten pianist began to echo far beyond the chapel walls. But this was only the beginning. The video of the old nun playing piano kept spreading. People from different countries were sharing it, tagging music pages, and commenting things like, "This brought tears to my eyes," or "I haven't heard music this pure in years." Yet, no one knew who she was or where she came from. That made it even more mysterious. They called her the piano nun, or the soul behind the keys. Some wanted to know her name. Some just wanted to hear her play again. Music teachers shared the video with their students. Grandparents shared it with their grandchildren. It was everywhere now. People didn't see her as just an old woman in a convent. They saw her as someone who had something the world had forgotten, music that came from the heart. Inside the convent, things were still calm. The old nun didn't ask about the video. She didn't use the internet. She didn't even own a phone. But she could feel that something had changed. More people were visiting the chapel now. Some came just to pray, but others came with hope. In their eyes, hoping to catch a moment of her music. One morning, younger sister who had first encouraged her sat beside her during breakfast and said gently, "The world wants to hear you again. Would you think about playing at the town charity event next month? It's for the children's hospital." The old nun looked at her for a long moment. Her eyes were calm but thoughtful. "I haven't played in front of people in so many years," she said softly. "What if I make a mistake?" The younger sister smiled. "You don't play with your hands. You play with your heart. That's why no one forgets." The old nun didn't answer right away. She looked out the window at the garden where sunlight was falling on the flowers. After a pause, she said, "All right, but only if no one claps. I don't want applause, just peace." The news that the piano nun would play at the charity event spread quickly. The event was usually small, with local singers and school children performing. But this year, the entire town seemed to be coming. Even nearby cities heard about it. People wanted to be there. Some brought flowers. Others just wanted to say thank you. The night of the event, the hall was full. There were chairs set up all the way to the back wall, and still, some people stood near the windows, just to hear the music. The stage was simple. A single piano sat in the center. There were no fancy lights, no big microphones, just silence. The old nun walked slowly onto the stage, dressed in her usual habit. The crowd became completely quiet. Some people had tears in their eyes just seeing her. She simply nodded, sat down at the piano, placed her hands on the keys. Then she began to play. The room filled with a sound so beautiful that people forgot where they were. Some closed their eyes, some held hands. Some cried without even knowing why. It wasn't just music it was feeling, memory, and something spiritual. She played as if the piano was part of her soul. When she finished, there was silence. Then, slowly, the crowd stood. No one clapped loudly. Instead, they stood still, with their hands over their hearts. It was a moment of respect, not noise. The old nun stood, bowed gently, and left the stage without saying a word. That night, a video of her performance was posted online again. It reached millions in just a few hours. But inside the convent, she returned to her quiet life, just as before. She watered her plants, folded laundry, and prayed. She didn't need the world to remember her name. She only wanted the music to speak. And now it was speaking louder than ever. After the charity concert, people couldn't stop talking about the piano nun. News channels started mentioning her performance. Music bloggers wrote articles with titles like "The Woman Who Played from the Heart" and "A Forgotten Soul Awakens the World." But even with all this attention, she remained in the same place, doing the same things, cooking in the convent kitchen, watering the plants, folding sheets. Nothing about her life changed, except the way people looked at her. Now, when visitors came to the convent, they often asked, "Is she here?" Some came just to sit in the chapel and listen, hoping to hear her play again. The old wooden pews were never empty. Even when she wasn't playing, people said they felt something special in that room, as if her music had left behind a quiet peace. The younger nun stayed close to her. She helped answer the many letters that were now arriving from around the world. Some were from people who said the music reminded them of their childhood. Others wrote about how they had given up on life, but her piano brought them hope again. One man even wrote, "I hadn't spoken to my mother in 10 years. After hearing you play, I called her." The old nun would read these letters slowly, her eyes soft, sometimes full of quiet tears. She didn't understand why the world was so moved. For her, the music had never been about fame. It had simply been a way to speak when words failed. She didn't want awards or interviews. All she wanted was for the music to do its work, and it was one day. The convent received a letter from a famous music academy. They invited her to come and speak to their students, or at least send a recording. They said her story could inspire young musicians to focus more on heart and soul, not just skill. The younger sisters were excited, but the old nun gently shook her head. "I'm not a teacher," she said softly. "I'm just someone who never forgot how to feel." Still, the academy's message made her think. That evening, she asked the younger nun, "Do we still have the old tape recorder?" Found it in a box in the storage room, dusty old, but still working. She recorded one piece, just one. It was a song she had written herself many years ago, but never played for anyone. She played it in one take. No edits, no second tries. Just her and the piano, in a quiet chapel filled with candlelight. The recording was sent to the academy. Days later, they replied with a heartfelt message. They had played her recording during a student assembly. The entire room had gone silent. Some students cried. Some stood up and clapped slowly. The teachers said it was the most emotional moment they had ever witnessed in their halls. Meanwhile, more people began writing to the convent. Not fans, not reporters, just regular people who had heard the music and wanted to say thank you. A nurse from another country said she played the video every night to calm her patients. A single mother said her baby only fell asleep to the sound of the piano nun. It was touching lives in ways no one had imagined. But in the middle of it all, the old nun remained the same. Her smile was still soft. Her steps were still slow. She still sat quietly in the garden, feeding the birds, whispering prayers under her breath. One evening, as the sun was setting, the younger nun asked her, "Do you realize how many lives you've touched?" The old woman looked out at the golden sky and said, "Music has always been a prayer. I just never knew the world was still listening." The sound of her piano had traveled far, but her heart had never left the chapel. The seasons began to change, and the air around the convent grew cooler. Leaves turned golden and fell gently onto the quiet garden paths. Life inside the convent moved as it always did, calm, slow, and full of small, peaceful routines. But something was different now. There was a quiet joy in the halls, a soft music in the air. Even when the piano wasn't playing, people still visited the chapel. Some came from nearby towns, others from far away. They never made noise, never brought big cameras or lights. They came with respect in their hearts, just wanting to sit where the music had once played. Some lit candles, some prayed, and some just closed their eyes and listened to the silence, hoping to feel what others had felt. The old nun didn't play often anymore. Her hands grew tired quicker than before. Some days her fingers felt stiff, and it was hard to move them across the keys. But on the days she could play, she did softly, slowly, just a few notes at a time. And every note still carried the same deep feeling, like a whisper from her soul. The younger nun stayed by her side more now. She helped her walk, served her tea in the mornings, and read letters to her when her eyes grew weak. They didn't speak much, but they didn't need to. Their bond had grown quietly, like a flower blooming without noise. One understood the other without many words. One evening, as the sky turned pink and the chapel lights began to glow, the old nun sat at the piano once more. Only a few sisters were present. The room was still. She played a soft tune, something she had written in her younger days, but never performed. It was peaceful, like the sound of a quiet stream. When she finished, she looked up, smiled gently, and whispered, "That might be the last time." The sisters around her felt their hearts tighten. They knew what she meant, but no one said anything. They just nodded, and one of them softly took her hand. In the weeks that followed, the old nun spent most of her time in her room or in the garden. She still smiled at everyone. She still fed the birds, but her body was growing tired. One morning, she didn't come to breakfast. The younger nun found her sitting by the window, wrapped in a blanket, looking out at the trees. "I think it's time for me to rest now," she said with a calm voice. She passed away peacefully that night in her sleep. No pain, no noise, just quiet, like her music. The news of her passing spread quickly. People who had never met her cried. They shared her videos again, wrote messages online, and told her story to others. Her music played on radios, on television, even in school classrooms. Music lovers, children, elderly people, everyone remembered the woman who played not for fame, but for feeling. The convent received hundreds of letters after she was gone. Some brought flowers, others sent small gifts, drawings, or poems. One message said, "She reminded us what real music feels like." Another simply said, "Thank you for waking up our hearts." No one moved it. Sometimes a sister would sit there and play a few quiet notes as if to keep her memory alive. And every now and then, someone said they could still feel her presence there, like a soft echo of something too beautiful to forget. The world had nearly missed her story, but in the end, it heard her loud and clear. She had once been forgotten, but through her music, she was remembered forever, not as a famous pianist, but as the woman who touched souls without needing to say a single word. And in that quiet chapel, her melody still lives.